We set off at midnight, just a road, stretching into darkness, with the dash lit up like a cockpit and shadows dancing under the headlights. I knew a solo road trip at this hour wasn't the safest, but there's something magnetic about a deserted road at night. It was just supposed to be a quick overnight haul through rural Tennessee, but I was already feeling antsy, like something was watching. Everything began to feel off around the second hour. The radio had been playing some late-night talk show, and I kept it on as background noise, something to drown out my overactive thoughts. But in the dead of night, the host's voice started to crackle and distort. I assumed it was just signal loss, but then the static turned into whispering, a low, barely audible sound filling the car. I couldn't make out the words, just a mumble that scraped against my nerves. When I tried to tune out, my car swerved slightly as my attention slipped. Heart pounding, I steadied the wheel and glanced around, my headlights illuminating nothing but endless road. Just then, out of the corner of my eye, something shifted in the rearview mirror. A flicker, like a shadow moving across the back seat. I turned sharply, hands tightening on the wheel, but there was nothing there. Shaken, I laughed it off. Stress, lack of sleep, this was just my imagination getting the best of me. Yet, as the miles ticked by, my mind kept wandering back to that flicker, the whispers, that subtle feeling of not being alone. The road stretched on, and the dark forests flanking either side grew thicker. Now, I swear it felt like eyes watching from every angle, like something lurked just out of reach of the headlights. At one point, I thought I caught a pair of eyes glinting from the side of the road. I slammed the brakes, heart racing. But when I looked again, there was only darkness. The silence became unbearable. I reached out to adjust the volume on the radio, desperate for some noise, anything to drown out the ominous stillness. The radio buzzed to life, but instead of music or a host, there was a faint, rhythmic breathing. I leaned closer, horrified and intrigued, trying to make sense of it. The breathing grew louder, like someone right behind me, exhaling slowly into my ear. My entire body froze, my skin crawling as I glanced back. The seat behind me was empty. Gripping the wheel like a lifeline, I took a deep breath, telling myself it was all in my head. I pushed harder on the gas, focusing only on the road, trying to shake the terror coiling around my spine. Just a trick of the mind, I repeated over and over until I almost believed it. Then, the headlights caught something up ahead, a figure standing in the middle of the road. My foot slammed on the brakes, and the car screeched to a halt, tires skidding. For a split second, I thought I'd hit whoever or whatever was out there, but when I opened my eyes, I saw nothing. Just the empty road stretching ahead, the lines on the pavement glowing faintly under the headlights. I sat there, panting, eyes wide, trying to process what just happened. I was sure I'd seen a figure. Tall, lanky, hunched over like a person, but not quite. The shape had seemed wrong, limbs slightly too long, the head tilted at an unnatural angle. But now there was nothing. Swallowing hard, I looked around, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. I had to keep going, whatever was happening. I couldn't just sit there in the middle of a desolate road. Trying to shake off the fear, I took a deep breath, put the car back in drive, and continued forward, slower this time, peering into the darkness. The road continued, winding and dipping as I drove through the thick woods. And then, just when I thought I'd imagined it all, my headlights flickered. For a moment they dimmed, then flashed back on. But in that brief moment of darkness, I saw it again, the figure standing just ahead, facing me, arms reaching out. My heart leaped into my throat. I blinked, and it was gone. I knew then that I couldn't just drive faster. It was as if the figure wanted me to see it, like it was toying with me, waiting for me to get close before vanishing. I had no idea what it was or how it kept appearing, but I felt certain it wanted something. Or worse, it wanted me. The whispers started again, faint and guttural, filling the car as if coming from the vents, seeping into my head. I tried to ignore them, focusing on the road, but they grew louder, like dozens of voices murmuring over each other. I couldn't make out any words, just a chaotic jumble of sounds, each voice overlapping, filling the car with an overwhelming sense of dread. That's when I saw something up ahead, lying across the road. I slowed down, squinting, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It looked like an animal carcass, sprawled out in the middle of my lane, fur matted, limbs twisted. But as I got closer, a chill washed over me. It wasn't an animal. It was a pile of clothes. Jeans, a flannel shirt, a pair of boots. scattered as if someone had melted out of them, like they'd just been left there, lifeless. I stopped the car again, frozen by the eerie sight. The pile of clothes looked recent, like someone had been standing there moments before, and then vanished, leaving only their clothing behind. The thought hit me hard, but I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just someone messing with me, an abandoned Halloween prank or some other sick joke. Then, as I stared at the empty clothes, my headlights flickered once more, and this time they stayed off for several seconds. The car plunged into darkness, and panic bubbled up inside me. I twisted the key, trying to bring the lights back on, but nothing happened. The engine sputtered, and I could feel the silence pressing down like a weight. And then I heard it, a soft, deliberate shuffling, came from outside the car, just beyond the reach of my vision. The hairs on my arms stood up, and I held my breath, straining to hear, but I wished I hadn't. The sound was unmistakable, like footsteps scraping along the gravel, circling the car. I didn't dare move. I felt like a prey animal, frozen, hoping that staying still might save me. The footsteps grew louder, slower, deliberate, until they stopped right beside my door. For a long, tense moment, there was nothing but silence. I couldn't bring myself to turn and look, not even a glance at the window. But then, just outside, I heard a soft whisper, close enough to send chills down my spine. Sounded familiar, a voice that was mine. "Come out," it said, in a perfect replica of my own voice, but with an unsettling edge, like the words were being drawn out in a sneer. "Come out and let's talk." I gripped the steering wheel harder, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do. The voice called again, more insistent this time, my own tone laced with malice. I kept my eyes straight ahead, refusing to look, refusing to acknowledge whatever was out there. But then, slowly, the door handle began to rattle. It jiggled once, twice, like someone was trying to open it. Then I heard my voice again, quieter this time, almost pleading. "Let me in." The handle rattled harder, almost violently now, and then stopped. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. I thought maybe, just maybe, whatever was out there had given up. But as soon as that thought crossed my mind, my phone screen lit up on the passenger seat. There was a new message. The sender's name was blank, just an empty space. But the message read, "Asterisk, I see you, asterisk." I stared at the screen, heart pounding, and then, with a sinking dread, I saw 3 little dots appear, typing. Another message popped up almost instantly. Asterisk, look in the rearview mirror, asterisk. My pulse hammered as I stared at the message. Every instinct screamed not to look, but it was as if some unseen force was drawing my gaze upward. Slowly, my eyes drifted to the rearview mirror. At first, I saw only the empty back seat, lit by the dim glow from my phone. But then, just as I began to breathe again, something shifted in the darkness. A shadow, a figure barely visible, was sitting there, right in the center of the back seat, motionless. I couldn't make out any features, just a vague silhouette with hollow pits where eyes should be, staring directly back at me. The air in the car grew thick, heavy with an unnatural chill that made it hard to breathe. I was paralyzed, caught between terror and disbelief, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. And then the figure moved, slowly, its head tilted to the side, as if studying me. A smile, or something close to it, began to spread across its face, the lips stretching too wide, unnatural, showing just a glimpse of teeth. I couldn't tear my eyes away, even as my stomach twisted with fear. The figure leaned closer, filling more of the mirror, its dark, hollow eyes fixed on mine. Suddenly, a new message buzzed on my phone, snapping me out of the trance. Asterisk, open the door, asterisk, it read. My hand was shaking so hard I nearly dropped the phone. Without thinking, I reached for the lock, almost as if under a spell, my fingers hovering just above the door handle. But at the last second, something inside me snapped, a primal instinct screaming to fight. I jerked my hand back, breaking whatever hold it had on me. I slammed my foot on the gas. The car lurched forward, tires screeching, and the shadowy figure disappeared from the mirror in a blur. My headlights flickered back to life, illuminating the empty road, and I sped forward, my heart hammering so hard it drowned out everything else. But the nightmare wasn't over. The road seemed different now, twisted, endless, stretching out like some terrible maze. No matter how fast I drove, it felt like I was going nowhere. The trees on either side warping into dark, grotesque shapes. Panic clawed at me as I realized I hadn't seen another car, another person, for what felt like hours. Another buzz from my phone. Asterisk, you can't outrun me, asterisk. I threw the phone to the passenger floor, refusing to look, and pressed harder on the gas. But just as I rounded a bend, I saw it again. The figure, standing in the middle of the road, grinning that too-wide grin, arms stretched out like it was waiting for me. This time I didn't stop. I swerved, but as I did, the car spun out of control, tires skidding on the gravel. The world tilted, and with a sickening lurch, the car flipped, rolling over once, twice, before finally slamming to a stop in the ditch. The world was silent, the air thick with dust and the smell of gasoline. I was hanging upside down, strapped into my seat by the seatbelt, my body aching from the impact. Every nerve was screaming, but I managed to reach up and release the belt, collapsing onto the roof of the car, now the floor. The eerie silence hung in the air, thick and pressing. I tried the door, but it wouldn't budge, jammed from the crash. Heart pounding, I pushed at the shattered windshield, kicking at it with all the strength I had left until it gave way, shards of glass falling around me as I crawled out. The night was pitch black, darker than I remembered, as if even the moon and stars had disappeared. My head was spinning, but I forced myself to stand, eyes darting around for any sign of that thing that had been haunting me. But there was nothing, just the empty road, stretching endlessly in either direction. And then I heard it, a whisper, soft but unmistakable, carried on the wind. Asterisk over here, asterisk. My breath hitched. The voice was coming from behind me. Slowly, I turned, my heart pounding so loud I could barely hear anything else. Standing in the tree line, half hidden by the shadows, was the figure. It hadn't moved from the last spot where I'd seen it on the road. It looked the same, that twisted, inhuman grin and hollow, black eyes watching me intently. I took a shaky step back, my body screaming to run, but I couldn't. My legs felt like lead, frozen in place as the figure began to move, gliding forward, not walking, but almost floating, like it was being pulled toward me by some invisible force. It stopped just at the edge of the road, only a few feet away, close enough that I could make out every unnatural detail. "Why are you running?" it whispered, its voice now clear, slicing through the silence with a chilling, almost mocking tone. It didn't sound like me this time. It sounded ancient, otherworldly, each word filled with an emptiness that twisted my stomach. I forced myself to speak, my voice shaking. "What do you want?" The figure tilted its head, as if considering the question. "You called to me, didn't you?" it said, its tone soft, almost amused. "You chose this road. You invited me here." A chill washed over me as I realized what it was saying. Every choice I'd made that night, the drive, the late hour, the solitude, somehow it had led to this, to it. I took another step back, the gravel crunching beneath my feet. I had to get away, get out of this nightmare, but something in me knew it wasn't going to be that easy. The figure's grin widened, stretching beyond what seemed possible, and it raised a long, bony finger, pointing down the road. "Keep going," it whispered, its tone low and menacing. "There's still a long way to go." As it spoke, the landscape around me began to shift. The road stretched out, warping, twisting, as if it were alive. Trees bent and warped, their branches stretching toward me like grasping fingers. Shadows danced along the edges, flickering in and out, shapes shifting that didn't belong. With no other choice, I stumbled back to my feet and broke into a run, my footsteps echoing through the empty night. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it following, gliding just behind me, its presence pressing down on me like a weight. The whispers returned, filling my head, echoing around me in a chorus of voices, each one darker than the last. My breaths came in ragged gasps as I ran, the road seeming endless, like I was trapped in some twisted loop that would never end. I could feel myself slipping, my mind fraying, like the darkness around me was creeping into my thoughts, unraveling me piece by piece. But then, just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I saw something up ahead, a faint glimmer of light flickering through the trees. It was small, barely more than a pinprick, but it was something, a lifeline in the darkness. I pushed myself harder, feet pounding the ground as I raced toward the light, my only hope of escape. But as I got closer, a terrible realization sank in. The light wasn't ahead of me, it was above me. I skidded to a halt, looking up, and saw something that made my blood run cold. There, hovering in the sky, was the figure, its hollow eyes staring down at me, the twisted grin wide and mocking. It opened its mouth, and in a voice that echoed through the night, it spoke one final, chilling word. Run. I bolted without a second thought, my legs moving on pure terror. The shadows around me seemed to come alive, shifting and contorting as if reaching out to snatch me. The trees grew denser, branches snagging at my clothes, scratching my skin. The road had vanished entirely. I was running blind through a nightmare forest, barely able to see in the suffocating darkness. Every few seconds, I'd glance up, and there it would be, floating just above, tracking me like a predator. Its mouth was open now, that impossibly wide grin revealing rows of teeth, and it was laughing, a horrible, rasping sound that filled the air around me, echoing through the trees and making the hair on my neck stand up. The forest opened up slightly, and in the faint moonlight filtering through the twisted branches, I saw what looked like an old cabin ahead. Its silhouette loomed, broken and decaying, barely standing against the night. There was no reason to think it would be safe, no logic in seeking refuge there, but I was desperate and it was my only option. I threw myself at the cabin door, slamming it open and stumbling inside, collapsing against the wall to catch my breath. The air was thick with dust, and the interior was pitch black, save for a faint glow filtering through the gaps in the rotting wood. I scanned the room, my eyes adjusting, taking in the warped floorboards, the peeling walls, and the damp smell of decay. The silence in the cabin was thick and absolute, pressing down on me like a weight. I forced myself to stand, listening carefully, but all I could hear was my own ragged breathing. I'd lost it, somehow, in the mad dash through the forest. But just as the relief started to settle, I heard it again, the faint, scratching sound of something moving across the wood. I froze, my gaze darting to the shadows pooling in the corners of the room. It was coming from above, a slow, scraping sound, like nails dragging across the ceiling. My heart pounded as I backed away, trying to make as little noise as possible. But with each step I took, the sound followed, directly overhead, tracking my every move. I reached the far corner of the room, pressing myself against the wall, my eyes fixed on the ceiling. And then, in the silence, a face slowly appeared in the gap between the beams, staring down at me. Its eyes were those same hollow pits, blacker than the shadows around them, and its grin stretched wide, that mouth full of teeth, gleaming in the dim light. It tilted its head, still watching, and then, slowly, it began to squeeze through the gap, its limbs bending in ways no human limbs should. The bones in its body cracked and popped, and its face twisted in unnatural angles as it pushed itself down, inch by inch, forcing its way through. In sheer terror, I looked around, searching desperately for any kind of weapon, something to defend myself. My hands landed on a piece of broken wood lying near my feet, a jagged shard from the splintered floorboards. I gripped it tightly, my hands slick with sweat, ready to fight, even though I had no idea what I was up against. The figure hit the floor with a sickening thud, its twisted form unfolding, stretching itself to full height. It was impossibly tall now, its head brushing the low ceiling, the arms and legs bending at wrong angles, like a puppet with its strings cut. The thing took a step toward me, each movement unnatural and jerky, as if it was learning to walk for the first time. My hands shook as I held up the jagged wood, my voice barely a whisper. "Stay back." But it only laughed, a hollow, rattling sound that filled the cabin, echoing off the walls. Then, in a single, swift motion, it lunged forward, closing the distance between us in an instant. I swung the wood, but it barely made contact, passing through the figure like it was made of smoke. I stumbled back, horrified, as its hollow eyes locked onto mine. "Why run?" it whispered, that ancient, mocking voice filling my head. "You can't escape." Its hands reached out, fingers extending far longer than they should have, curling around my shoulders. The cold seeped through my skin, and in that instant, I felt it. An overwhelming flood of despair, memories that weren't my own, twisted images of lost souls, trapped in suffering, their silent screams filling my mind. I tried to pull away, but its grip held, tightening, and I felt myself slipping, my vision blurring as the room around me faded, replaced by darkness. But then, from somewhere deep inside, I summoned a final surge of willpower, a desperate burst of strength. I threw my head back, breaking the figure's gaze, and with all the force I had, I shoved it backward. The creature stumbled just slightly, but it was enough. I turned and ran, throwing myself toward the broken cabin door, tearing it open and plunging back into the forest. I didn't stop, couldn't. I ran blindly through the trees, the wind cutting my face, branches clawing at my skin, the laughter echoing behind me, growing fainter but never truly gone. Finally, as dawn broke over the horizon, I stumbled out of the trees and onto a main road, collapsing as the first rays of sunlight washed over me. I looked back at the forest, now bathed in the morning light, empty and still, as if the nightmare had never happened. But I knew it had, and I knew that somewhere in those twisted trees, in the darkness waiting just beyond the light, it was still there, watching, waiting for the next traveler to wander down that lonely road. I lay on the side of the road, staring into the sky as the sun rose, warming the chill that had settled into my bones. My body ached. My skin stung from countless scratches and bruises, but I was alive. Somehow I'd made it through the night. I forced myself to sit up, glancing back at the forest, half expecting to see the figure lurking there. But the trees stood still and silent, casting long shadows across the ground. It felt like hours passed as I sat there, waiting for the shock to wear off, trying to convince myself it was over. Eventually, I heard the distant rumble of an engine. A pickup truck appeared, coming down the road toward me, and I waved my arms, relief flooding through me as it slowed and pulled over. The driver was a middle-aged man, his face weathered and concerned as he looked me over. "What happened to you?" he asked, voice laced with disbelief. I opened my mouth to explain, but the words caught in my throat. How could I explain any of what had happened without sounding insane? My mind raced, struggling to find something, anything, normal to say. In the end, I just shook my head. "I got lost in the woods," I managed to say, though the words sounded hollow, even to me. The man nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing as he took in the state of my clothes, the bruises, the cuts on my face and arms. He didn't ask any more questions, just opened the passenger door and motioned for me to get in. I climbed into the truck, grateful for the warmth and the feeling of solid ground beneath me. The man drove in silence, the road winding away from the forest, taking me farther and farther from the nightmare I'd just escaped. But even as the miles passed, that sense of dread stayed with me, a weight pressing down on my chest. Finally, the man glanced over at me. "You're lucky," he said, his tone oddly serious. "That forest's no place to be at night. People disappear out there." A chill ran down my spine. "Disappear?" I echoed, my voice barely a whisper. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "Been stories about those woods for as long as I can remember. People say there's something in there, a spirit maybe, or a demon, shows itself to travelers who stray too far off the beaten path." I felt my stomach twist, the memories of the night rushing back in vivid detail. Have you seen it?" He shook his head slowly. "No, but I've heard enough. People say it takes on different forms, plays tricks with your mind, makes you see things that aren't real. Some say it'll follow you for miles, appear in your mirror, or whisper to you on dark roads. The truck fell silent again, and I stared out the window, watching as the forest disappeared behind us, replaced by open fields and morning light. A part of me wanted to believe it was all over, that I'd escaped whatever horror had been lurking in those woods. But his words stayed with me, echoing in my mind. After a few more miles, he dropped me off at a gas station near the highway. I thanked him and watched as he drove away, leaving me alone again, though this time in daylight. I walked inside, feeling out of place in my torn, dirty clothes, but the cashier barely glanced at me, just nodded in acknowledgement. I bought a bottle of water and a map, studying the roads carefully. I was done with shortcuts, with quiet, isolated routes. I'd stick to the main highways, stay where the light and the people were, keep as far from those dark, lonely places as I could. As I walked back to my car, I caught my reflection in the glass of the gas station window. My heart stopped. Just for a split second, I saw something else in the reflection, standing behind me. A tall, dark figure, grinning with that hollow-eyed stare. I blinked, and it was gone. Just my own wide-eyed face staring back at me. My hands shook as I unlocked the car and climbed inside, gripping the wheel until my knuckles turned white. I took one last look at the gas station, the empty fields stretching out around me, and then I drove off, leaving that place, that forest, and everything that had happened far behind. But as I merged onto the highway, my eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those hollow eyes staring back. There was nothing there, just the empty road, stretching endlessly into the distance. Yet the feeling remained that somewhere, somehow, it was still watching. I drove in silence, gripping the wheel tightly, forcing myself to focus on the road. It was over. I had escaped. But even as I tried to convince myself of that, I couldn't shake the sense that I was followed. My eyes kept drifting to the rearview mirror, scanning the road behind me for any hint of that figure. But every time, I saw only empty asphalt stretching back, bathed in morning light. The radio was off. I didn't dare turn it on, afraid I'd hear that awful breathing or those whispers again. The silence in the car felt thick, almost suffocating, but I told myself it was just my nerves. The nightmare was over. I'd made it out. Yet, I couldn't let go of the dread sitting heavy in my gut. About an hour into the drive, my phone buzzed from where I tossed it on the passenger seat. I jumped, nerves on edge, and hesitated before picking it up, heart pounding as I unlocked the screen. There was a new text. No name, no number, just a blank space as before. My throat tightened as I opened the message, bracing myself for whatever horror might be waiting. But it was just one word. *remember*. The air seemed to drain from my lungs. I threw the phone back onto the seat, my hands shaking as I returned my focus to the road, forcing myself to ignore it. Just a glitch, I told myself. Maybe something left over from last night, some delayed message. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The miles stretched on, and the world around me seemed to blur, an endless stretch of highway that felt like it was leading nowhere. I tried to stay calm, but the feeling was there, gnawing at me. It hadn't let go. I was still connected to whatever had stalked me through that forest, as if I'd stepped into its world, and it had marked me. Suddenly, the road curved, and I saw a figure standing on the shoulder up ahead. My heart stopped. At first, I thought it was just a hitchhiker, a lone silhouette waiting by the side of the road. But as I got closer, I felt the icy dread creeping back. The figure was wearing my clothes. I stared, my mind racing, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. It wore the same torn shirt, the same jeans, stained with the dirt and scratches from my escape. The figure stood perfectly still, staring at me with a hollow-eyed gaze that felt both familiar and wrong. It raised a hand, slowly, and pointed directly at me, its finger like an accusation. My grip tightened on the wheel as I sped up, desperate to get past it, to leave it behind. As I drove by, the figure's head turned, following me with that empty stare, watching as I passed. And just before I lost sight of it in the mirror, it smiled. A smile that stretched too wide, unnatural, the same grin I'd seen in the forest. The road ahead was empty again, but my heart wouldn't stop pounding, the blood roaring in my ears. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, telling myself that it wasn't real. Couldn't be. I'd been through too much, maybe I was just seeing things, the lingering effects of whatever terror I'd endured. But then my phone buzzed again. Another message. Asterisk, look in the mirror, asterisk. My blood turned to ice. I didn't want to look. I knew, somehow, that if I did, I would see something that would shatter any hope of escape. But the compulsion was too strong. With a trembling hand, I lifted my gaze to the rearview mirror. There it was. The figure was sitting in the back seat, a twisted replica of me, watching with those empty, hollow eyes, its face twisted in that same awful grin. It leaned forward, lips parting, and I could feel its cold breath on the back of my neck, hear its voice echoing in my mind. Asterisk, remember, asterisk, it whispered, the word twisting like a blade in my mind, filling me with a dread so deep it felt like it would swallow me whole. I screamed, slamming my foot down on the gas, my body going numb as I raced down the highway. I kept my eyes fixed on the road, refusing to look back, heart pounding as the figure's words echoed in my mind. The memory of its face seared into my vision. When I finally dared to glance in the mirror again, the back seat was empty, but the feeling remained, that cold, unshakable presence, lingering just out of sight, waiting. I knew then, in a way that defied logic, that it would never truly leave, that somehow I had crossed into its world, and no amount of distance could ever break the connection. And as the miles stretched on, I realized with a sinking certainty that it didn't matter where I went or how fast I drove. It would always be with me. I drove for hours, numb and hollow, lost in a fog of terror. Towns came and went, blurred snapshots through the window, but none felt real. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was trapped on an endless loop, like I'd never left the road that had led me into the woods, as if reality itself had twisted into some dark reflection. My body moved on autopilot. I stopped for gas, bought coffee I couldn't taste, barely making eye contact with anyone I passed. I'd grown paranoid, glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see that figure again, my twisted doppelganger lurking in every shadow. The days stretched into a strange haze, and the further I got, the deeper my dread grew. I was beginning to feel like I couldn't trust what was real anymore. My phone had gone silent. I'd received no more messages since the last one, but I knew, in my gut, that it was only a matter of time. Eventually, I reached the outskirts of a town I didn't recognize, a place where I hoped I could hide, just long enough to feel sane again. I checked into a motel, a dingy, dimly lit room with peeling wallpaper and the faint smell of mildew. It wasn't comforting, but I didn't care. I locked the door, drew the curtains, and sank into the bed, hoping exhaustion would drown out the fear. But sleep didn't bring peace. It brought nightmares. In my dreams, I was back on that road, walking through the forest alone. The air was thick with fog, swirling in and out of the trees like something alive. I heard the whispers again, faint at first, growing louder with each step, like the voices were pressing in on me, closing the gap. They called my name over and over, a chorus of voices, my own voice distorted and wrong. Then I saw it, the figure standing just ahead, watching me. It was wearing my face, twisted and stretched, and I knew, somehow, that it was feeding off my fear, growing stronger with every step I took toward it. Its mouth opened, wider than any human mouth could, and it began to laugh, the sound hollow and endless, echoing through the trees, filling my head. I jolted awake, drenched in sweat, my pulse racing. The room was pitch black, and for a moment, I couldn't remember where I was. Panic gripped me as I fumbled for the bedside lamp, my hands shaking as I turned it on. The light flickered, dim and unsteady, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. I sat up, trying to calm my breathing, telling myself it was just a dream. But as I glanced around, I saw something that froze my blood. My reflection in the mirror across the room wasn't moving. I stared, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. My reflection was sitting up, eyes wide, staring back at me with an expression of sheer terror. But it wasn't mirroring my movements. It sat perfectly still, watching, waiting. I wanted to scream, to look away, but I couldn't. Slowly, the reflection's mouth began to twist into a grin. That same twisted, too wide smile, and it raised a hand, waving slowly, mockingly. My own hand stayed by my side, frozen. Then, without warning, the reflection leaned forward, pressing its hands against the glass, as if it were trying to push through. Its eyes gleamed, hollow and endless, and I could feel its gaze piercing through me, a force pulling me closer to the mirror, like it was trying to swap places. I stumbled back, heart hammering, my mind racing as I turned away from the mirror, refusing to look. I closed my eyes, repeating to myself that it wasn't real, that it couldn't hurt me. But the whispers returned, filling the room, soft at first, then growing louder, echoing from the walls, the floor, the ceiling, all around me. My name over and over in that same distorted, mocking tone until I thought I would go mad. And then, from behind me, a voice whispered, close enough that I could feel the cold breath on my neck. Asterisk, let me in, asterisk. I whirled around, but there was nothing there. Just the empty room, bathed in the dim, flickering light. My reflection in the mirror had returned to normal, but I knew, deep down, that it was only hiding, waiting for the right moment to break free. I stumbled to the door, desperate to escape, to get away from that thing that had latched onto me, feeding off my fear. But as I opened the door, stepping out into the night, I heard it again, the laughter echoing down the empty hall, filling the air with a sense of dread so deep it felt like it would consume me. I ran, out of the motel, onto the street, not stopping, not looking back. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away, had to keep moving. But no matter how far I ran, no matter how fast I drove, I could feel it following, lurking in the shadows, waiting. And somehow, I knew that as long as I lived, as long as I remembered that night, it would always be there, watching, waiting, ready to take my place. I don't know how long I ran. The night seemed endless, stretching out into a blur of dim streetlights and empty roads, the cold wind cutting into my skin. Eventually, I stumbled into the town center, a desolate stretch of closed shops and silent streets. I slowed down, gasping for breath, feeling my legs trembling beneath me. Every shadow seemed to shift, every corner held a lurking threat. I scanned my surroundings, looking for any sign of life, anything that could ground me back to reality. The town was deserted. I'd lost any sense of time, but it felt like it had to be close to dawn. Yet the sky remained dark, as if night had swallowed the world whole. I leaned against a street lamp, hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath, to calm the frantic beat of my heart. But as soon as I stopped, the silence pressed in, thick and heavy, and I knew I couldn't stay here, exposed. I needed shelter, somewhere to hide, at least until morning. Across the street, I spotted an old diner, its sign flickering, casting a dull neon glow. I staggered toward it, my steps unsteady, my vision blurry. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and a bell jingled, breaking the suffocating silence. The inside was dim, the lights low, casting long shadows over empty booths. But at least it was warm and there was no sign of it. I slid into a booth near the back, slumping against the worn vinyl seat, and tried to gather my thoughts. I needed to calm down, to think rationally. But my mind was clouded with terror, every nerve on edge, as if that thing, asterisk my doppelganger asterisk, was lurking just outside, waiting to strike. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing, to let the warmth soothe my frayed nerves. But even in the silence, I could still hear the faint echo of its laugh, feel the cold prickle of its presence like fingers brushing against my skin. A soft shuffle broke the silence, and I jolted, my eyes snapping open. A waitress was standing in front of me, her face worn and tired, looking at me with a strange mix of concern and suspicion. "You okay, Han?" she asked, her voice low and raspy. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. She eyed me for a moment, then slid a cup of coffee onto the table, steam curling up into the air. "On the house. You look like you've been through it." "Thank you," I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible. She nodded, giving me one last look before retreating behind the counter. I wrapped my hands around the mug, feeling the warmth seep into my skin, grounding me, pulling me back from the edge. But as I took a sip, a flash of movement caught my eye. In the reflection of the diner's window, I saw a figure standing just outside, watching me. My heart froze, the coffee slipping from my grip, spilling across the table. I turned to look, dread twisting in my gut. The street was empty. I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light. But when I looked back at the window, I saw it again. My own reflection, standing behind me, smiling that same twisted smile, eyes hollow and dark. My reflection's hand lifted, pressing against the glass, fingers splayed, reaching out. A chill washed over me as I realized my own hand hadn't moved. I jerked away from the window, my heart hammering, refusing to look back, afraid of what I might see. The whispers began again, soft at first, then louder, filling the diner, echoing off the walls. "Asterisk, let me in, asterisk," it whispered. My own voice distorted and warped, repeating over and over, a chant that grew louder, pressing down on me, filling my mind. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the edges of the table, fighting to hold onto reality, to block it out. But the whispers only grew, an insistent hum in my head, drowning out everything else. Suddenly, a hand touched my shoulder. I flinched, eyes flying open, and looked up to see the waitress staring down at me, her brow furrowed. "You all right?" she asked, her voice cutting through the whispers, grounding me. I nodded, forcing a shaky smile. "Yeah, just tired." She didn't look convinced, but nodded and walked away, leaving me alone in the booth. The whispers had stopped, the silence pressing in again. I glanced back at the window, half expecting to see that figure standing there, but it was empty. My reflection looked back at me, normal, mundane, just me. But I knew it was still there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for a moment of weakness, a sliver of fear. I couldn't stay here. I stood, pulling a few bills from my pocket and tossing them onto the table before slipping out of the diner. The night was cold, the air sharp, cutting into my lungs as I walked back to my car, my footsteps echoing through the empty streets. The sun was beginning to rise, a faint glow on the horizon, casting the world in a pale, ghostly light. I climbed into my car, the seat cold and unfamiliar, and started the engine, eager to put as much distance between myself and this place as possible. As I drove out of town, the road stretched out ahead, bathed in the soft light of dawn. For the first time in days, I felt a glimmer of hope, the darkness lifting, fading into the light. But just as I began to relax, glancing in the rearview mirror, I saw it. Asterisk myself, asterisk sitting in the back seat, staring at me with hollow eyes and that wide, twisted smile. Its lips parted, and it whispered, soft and mocking, filling the car with a chilling finality. "Asterisk, you can't run forever, asterisk." And as I looked ahead,